Welcome back to Line by Golf. I'm your host Ross McGuire, and this week's episode is a special one featuring Gary Alliss talking about his own journey and the amazing story of the Alliss family, including his dad Peter and grandfather Percy. Let's go over to Gary. Gary Alliss, thanks for joining the podcast. Great to have you with us.
No, pleasure, Ross. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, no problem. And Gary, we'll just start with a simple question. What's it like to be part of the Alliss family and the legacy of that name over time?
Well, it's lovely to be part of the family. Years and years ago, when I first became an assistant, I always used to say, when people came into the golf shop or were talking to me, and I used to say to people, do you know, if I could have £1 for every person who comes in and says, are you anything to do with Peter Alliss? And I say, I have a lot of money. Anyway, the old man became so famous that I actually changed it and decided that if I could have just had a penny, I would have been a multi-millionaire. It was amazing. Yeah, the old man was very, very famous. But I think the legacy, the fact that as a family we cover, 107 years since Granddad became a PGA member just after the First World War. He survived.
My goodness.
He survived getting shot twice. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Wow, that's incredible. And we're going to dig into the story of your grandfather later as well, Gary. But what I wanted to start with was, look, you've got obvious golf connections in the family, but where did golf actually start for you? Of course, it's in the family, but what was it for you that got you going in the game?
Well, I used to go when Dad was home. He was away such a lot playing, but he and his brother in 1957, when I was 3 years old, they took on the joint professionals role at Parkstone. My granddad was at Ferndown, just outside Bournemouth, and Dad's elder brother was also a pro, and they decided they would join forces and apply for the job at Parkstone when Reg Whitcomb died, and they were lucky enough to get it. So basically they set up with Alec being the club pro and Dad being the tournament playing pro, and as a sort of spokesman, I suppose, for Parkstone. So we lived close by. I used to go down there then, and I would just putt a bit. But basically, the starting of a bit more serious play for me was with Grandad. My granddad taught me how to play. I used to go to Ferndown. He would actually come in to our house where we had nets in the garden, and he would come along and we'd spend an hour or so hitting balls into the net and doing a bit of putting on the carpet and things. So basically, Percy told me everything that I knew about golf, and I played fairly often. I liked hitting golf balls. I liked putting. I liked going with Dad to play, but it was hard work because, a couple of hits, he was on all the par fives. I was about 6, 7 years old and couldn't hit it over the heather in front of the tee and things at Parkstone. So I was always sort of hitting and running to try and keep up with him. But anyway, that's where it started. And, we stayed like that, I suppose, until Mum and Dad got divorced just when I went away to boarding school. And I played really up until I was 13 and then didn't want to play for all sorts of reasons that I guess were to do with being away, them getting divorced. Dad took the pros job up at Morallerton. So he moved up there with my stepmom. And it wasn't until I'd been left school for a year, I turned down going to university, and then I decided to start playing again, which is a story in itself, which I'll tell you in a second.
So what kind of age were you then? Were you like 17, 18 when you were getting back towards playing golf again?
Yeah, I was just shy of my 19th birthday. I left school, I took my A-levels and passed them and had been offered a place at Bristol University. But I really didn't tell either Mum or Dad. I just thought, I was going to go and read Spanish and French. And I thought, what can you do with Spanish and French? I thought, except be a teacher. And I thought, I can't think of anything more horrible. The last thing I want to be is a teacher. And then look at me, I spent almost all my career teaching people to play golf.
Oh, that's funny. And then, so you eventually turned pro. So what was it that took you into the path of being a PGA pro and taking that step?
Well, as I said, I'd been left school a year. I'd had various jobs just to sort of something to do. I worked for a little while at a motel and in a bar. Then I worked for a builder. And it was sort of coming towards the summer of, 1973. And I thought, I'm kind of missing. I haven't played any sport. I wasn't particularly good at any sport, but it wasn't a very big school I was at, so you could get in the team very easily and play all the sports. And as I said, I hadn't fallen out with Dad, but he was living up in Leeds. And I thought, I don't know, I'll give Dad a ring. So I picked the phone up And he answered, Peter Alliss. I said, oh, Dad, it's Gary. What do you want? Was the first thing that he said to me. And I said to him, Dad, I'm thinking of playing golf again. And he went, you what? I said, I'm thinking of playing. He said, are you serious? I said, yeah. He said, what did you just say? So I told him again. And then he said, are you serious? Yes, I'll call you back, he said, and put the phone down on me. Well, because
Brilliant.
we had drifted a bit apart, he said it took him about 2 or 3 days to get back to me. And he said, God, he said, it was difficult to track you down. I even had to ring and speak to your bloody mother to find out where you were. Anyway, he got back to me and he said, look, are you serious about this? Yes, Dad, I'm serious. I'd like to give it a go. I'll call you back. So anyway, a day or so went past. He rang me back and he said, look, I fixed you up at Parkstone with a 3-month membership. He said, you'd better get down there, hit a few balls, see what you can remember, see how you get on. So I said, okay. And then he went, oh, by the way, have you got any clubs? So I said, yeah, a junior set. I said, I haven't played since I was 12, but I said, I think I'm a bit big for them now. And he went, oh, no. He said, well, I tell you what, I'll send you an old set of mine. He said, I haven't got very many old sets. Never had that many clubs. He said, I'll send you one of mine. And he said, I'll send you a pair of my shoes. He said, they're probably a bit big because he said, I think my feet are a size bigger than yours, but you'll have to put up with them. And that's what happened. And he sent them to me. And so as soon as they arrived a couple of days later, I started going down to Parkstone every day, hitting balls, playing a few holes. I put in 3 scorecards to the club and they gave me a 13 handicap as a starter. And I then spent the next 2 or 3 months I couldn't play at all, but I knew Parkstone pretty well, playing in competitions. I got my handicap down to 4 and that was really it. Then I thought, well, anyway, Dad and I were in contact. He said, how are you getting on? I said, oh, I'm doing all right. Anyway, that was that. And then he rang me probably about November time, 73, and he said, do you remember when we used to go to Trevose? And I said, yes, Dad. Yeah, I did. You know, we went down. We'd sometimes have a little bit of holiday. You were playing exhibition matches when it was Devon and Cornwall. And I said, we used to stay there. He said, yeah. He said, I was talking to Gammon. Peter Gammon was the owner. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but the club is still owned by the Gammon family. And he said, yeah, I was talking to Peter Gammon. He said, I happened to mention to him that you started to play golf. He said, he told me, doesn't want a job, does he? And Dad said, well, I don't know. I said, he's only been playing a couple of months. He can't play. He said, oh, that doesn't matter. He said, Raymond, my pro, he said, he's lost his wife last summer. Unfortunately, she got cancer. She used to work all the time. And he's really struggling a bit because he's got 3 grown-up boys, but a young son. And he really needs some help. So Dad said, well, he can't. Oh, it doesn't matter. He can come down here and learn how to play. He'll learn how to play down here. And so Dad rang me back. He said, this has happened. And so I said, well, what do you think? And he said, well, if I were you, I would get down there and see what's going on. Because he said, it'll be a long time if you're thinking of being an assistant, probably before you get an opportunity or you're a good enough player or anything to be taken on. He said, I should get down there. Anyway, cut a long story short, went to Cornwall a couple of days later. And they just sort of said, well, do you want to come and start this week? I mean, you could never do it now because you have to have certain handicaps and playing. Back then in 1973, it was just, rock up. Peter Gammon let me live in the winter. I was able to live in the club's accommodation. And then in the summertime, I rented a caravan and lived in that. And so that's how my 3 years training with the PGA started. And then just under 3 years later, I went up to Lillishall, where the training was then, and passed and then became a fully fledged member of the PGA. And off I began on my 50-year journey.
Wow. What a story that is. That's so cool. And Trevose I've never been there, but I've heard amazing stories about it. It's maybe a really, really nice course. I'd love you to describe it a little bit, Gary, for the listeners as well, who maybe haven't been there.
Trevose is a wonderful place. I mean, not only is it a great Harry golf course, but they have a full-sized 9-hole golf course that Dad actually designed for them, the Headland course. And they have quite a challenging little par 3 course as well. Plus, they've got self-catering accommodation, which accommodates about 120 people. Lovely clubhouse, super restaurant. And as I say, it's been family-owned pretty much since it started. And last year, they celebrated their 100th birthday. And it is a wonderful, the Harry Cole course. It's just a great golf course. Hosted a number of quite big events, bearing in mind that it's on the North Cornish coast, pretty much miles from anywhere. But Dad won 2 of his West of England PGA championships back there in the 1960s and things. Yeah, it was always a great favourite of Dad's. He loved Trevose and he loved Peter Gammon. They were great buddies.
Then at that point, you've turned pro. What was that like for you in qualified? Did you start playing in regional events and stuff, or were you focusing more on coaching from
I
the
tried
start?
very hard. Yeah, I did. I tried very hard. I practiced and played in as many things as I could. And, I was getting better. And in the region and in Cornwall, I was okay. I mean, I could win an alliance. I could win a Cornish event. Sometimes if there was an event for Devon and Cornwall, I'd be there or thereabouts. But I still had an awful lot to learn. What I did discover, though, my first boss was a lovely chap. But he said to me, he said, I'll help you golf. And he said, you can earn a little bit. Because I said, oh, can I teach? And he said, no, of course you can't teach. He said, you don't know anything about it. But he said, you are a pretty good player. And he said, I think, if you go out and play with people, it'll help your golf. You can give them a few pointers. He said, going out and playing with people is a much better lesson, in my opinion, than just standing bashing balls on a practice ground anyway. So basically, that's what I did. And I was earning a couple of pounds for 9 holes and things playing with people. But what I realized was that although I wanted to be a great player, I wanted to be, up there winning tournaments like Dad and Granddad had done. But after a couple of years, I began to realize, I don't know whether it was the missing years or just a lack of talent or whatever, but I was never going to set the world on fire as a player. I was going to be a good PGA pro in the county and things like that, but I probably was never going to be much better than occasionally scraping into an event. Because back then, of course, you could enter Monday pre-qualifying. So a couple of times I did manage to get into a tournament. Yeah, that was how it was then. So you could go along for Monday qualifying. And I got into a couple of events. But I realized I was the strongest player in every field because at the end of the week, I was holding everybody up from the bottom.
I'm sure Butch Harmon's dad came out with a line like that as well. I think he said, I was looking at the newspaper results. I didn't know you'd won at the weekend. And Butch is like, what do you mean I was last? He goes, yeah, I must have been holding newspaper upside down.
Yeah. That's exactly the thing. I think, there are vague similarities between Butch's family and our family. Anyway, so what I found was that I was actually okay at demonstrating stuff to people and getting the word across and sort of helping them to do better and making a plan for them on the golf course. And that really opened the door into where I spent most of my career, which was teaching people to play.
Brilliant. And it's interesting you started doing that on the course. Was that something you featured a lot throughout your career, Gary? Have you tried to get people out in the course more than doing sort of work on ranges and things? Is that something you've always done?
I always have tried to get out there. I think one of the difficulties is as I became a bit more successful and more in demand, if you like, it was actually quite hard to satisfy the demand and take everybody on the course. There just weren't enough hours in the day. So I would try to mix it up. And, equally, one of the things that I think is difficult for every teaching pro, and I'm sure it's still the same now, you can say to a pupil, we'll go and play 3 holes, 6 holes, 9 holes, whatever you decide to do. We're going to have an hour on the course. And you fix up to do it at 12:30 or whatever. And of course, suddenly you find that there's 2 or 3 people on the tee. There's a slow group out there. You sometimes find yourself almost trying to dart around. And there are definitely times where I think, I don't know whether if I'd have been paying for this, I'd have enjoyed it because there's too many people out here. There are a number of things against taking people on the course. And that's why I like Trevose, because we were lucky enough to have the main championship course, a full length 9-hole and the par 3. I could take people for whatever their ability was to whichever place was right for them. And as I was there, I got to know that lessons on the golf course were always going to be very difficult in school holidays because they were packed. But I could work out the times, and sometimes I'd say to people, look, if you don't mind, we should get on the course at 7 o'clock in the morning and we'll have it to ourselves. Or we should go on the course if it's June, shall we go out at 8 o'clock in the evening? Yeah, okay. So, I was tried to always be very flexible and just give people what they wanted, and I enjoyed myself.
Yeah. And then how long did you stay at Trevose? Gary, how long were you there?
I had 2 stints at Trevose because I was assistant there up until 1977. And then I thought I would like to develop my teaching. And I thought, well, I need to see 1 or 2 other golf courses. So I was lucky enough through the help of Clive Clark, who at that time was working with Dad. and was obviously doing some commentary, but was the pro at Sunningdale. And he said, my good friend John Cook is the pro at East Berks, and he's looking for a teaching pro. His teaching pro has taken a full club pro's job, and I know John's looking. So I went to see John, and John said, yeah. So I went from Trevose to East Berks for a couple of years. And after that, I thought, I think I'm ready for my first full pro's job. So I then applied for just a couple of jobs, and I got the full pro's job at Harpenden in Hertfordshire. And I was there for 4 years. Lovely course, a Parkland course, which again had good practice facilities. And I think probably being in those places, it brought me into contact with one or two better players. And it wasn't just the teaching. I loved being a club pro. I liked selling stuff and selling clubs and fitting people out, and certainly being around Hertfordshire. I played a lot there because there was a lot of playing to be done. So I developed my own playing a bit there. And then at the end of Harpenden, in fact, it was Dad's 50th birthday, which was 1981, February the 28th. I remember it very well. It was a Saturday evening, and the old boy said, I'm having a party for my 50th. Do you want to come? So I said, yeah, Dad, that's great. So he said, well, come down, stay overnight. So I drove, obviously, down to Surrey where he lived, and it was a big party. All the great and the good were there, all his buddies, all his TV buddies, celebrities, golfers, my half-brothers and sisters and their friends, and everybody was there. And Peter Gammon was there from Trevose. But, it was probably, 1 o'clock in the morning. We'd all had a lot to drink. And Peter was funny. He came wandering. He wasn't very tall, Peter, and by that time he'd put on a bit of weight. He was towards the end of his life, he was nearly as round as he was tall. And he came over to me. He said, "Oh, Gary, dear boy," he said, "I haven't had a chance to speak to you tonight." And I said, "Oh, Peter, no, lovely to see you. How are you doing? How are you getting on with the job?" "Oh, pretty good, Peter. Thanks. I'm enjoying it." He said, "Well, Raymond retires next year, at the end of next year. I assume you're coming back." So I said, "Are you asking if I'd like to be your pro?" "Well, yes, of course." So I said, "Yes, please."
Brilliant. Thanks for listening to Link by Golf. I also co-host a new podcast with Colin Gray called Both Sides of Par. Every episode explores the different sides of the game, from drills and practice habits to course strategy, mindset, equipment, and the realities golfers face at every handicap level. If you enjoy the conversations here, I think you'll really love this one too. Follow Both Sides of Par now on your favourite podcast platform so you don't miss the first episodes. Just search for Both Sides of Par or go to bothpar.com. Now let's get back to the pod.
And so that was that. And I never heard any more. I didn't expect to hear more because once Peter had said something to you, that was it. It was set in stone. He would never change his mind. Anyway, I handed in my notice at Harpenden, which was just before the Christmas, November, December. And then I was working out 3 months' notice, getting all ready. Peter gets in contact. "Gary, dear boy, I've got a bit of a problem." "Oh, what's that?" "Well, Raymond's, he's been here 50 years. Yes. Well, he said, "Silly old fool," he said. "He decided to boost his pension by not declaring anything to the taxman for the last 2 years. And they've caught him. And he's asked, can he do another summer season?" And he said, "I can't really say no, can I?" So I said, "No, you can't really." So he said, "Dear boy, do you think you can find something to do for a year and then come to us?" So I said, "Yeah, I guess so, So anyway, I was back on the phone. It was like all those years before, almost the same sort of phone call. "Dad, it's Gary. What do you want?" I said, "Well, this has happened." "Christ," he said. "Tell you what," he said, "you'd better come here." I said, "Well, don't you want to speak to Jackie?" No, Jackie will be all right." She said, "We've just built Old Thorns Golf Club. It's opened. We've moved the offices of Alliss, Thomas, and all our things are down there now." He said, "We'll find something for you to do." He said, "I'll go and talk to Pat Dawson, the MD for there, and we'll sort it out." So he said, "Just finish out your notice and then come down here." So in February 1983, I decamped back to living at home.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So
that's funny.
And then I stayed at Trevose for 20 odd years. It was great. But the club, as often happens, the club passed from Peter Gammon to his son Nick. And as with a lot of proprietary clubs, they wanted to take over the retail golf shop and bits and pieces. And, much as we tried to do a deal, it's very difficult. I mean, it was a good job. I mean, I did very well there, but I couldn't ever see myself then giving up the shop and the freedom that I had to work for somebody else for a salary.
Yeah.
And
And
I
it's
actually,
happened. I think it's
yeah,
happened to a lot of clubs now, Gary. There's a lot of clubs doing it,
I think you're
taking
absolutely right,
over the
Ross.
shop. And
I don't think the job that I did for almost all my career is really quite the same now. You know, that old traditional club pros job, I think, has changed and is still changing and developing and progressing. You know, I'm sure it's great if you didn't know any difference and I was starting again, I would start again. You know, I had what I had, but I did actually have at the time. We had a hotel in Wadebridge, not far from the club, where they'd actually set up a little golf academy. So I thought, I've got somewhere that I can teach a bit and still in the same area. But the only blow from that was the guy who owned it was very, very wealthy and had made his money in the food industry and decided to sell up and everything and went to live in Portugal. So suddenly the place that I was teaching, that was sold from under my feet. But that's when I got very lucky because I got a call through the PGA from their headquarters, which were at the Belfry. And they said to me, we're thinking of going in a different direction again, going back to having a rather more traditional head pro, but somebody who is fairly well known and can help us with our PR promotions and be used in our advertising. And we'd like you to come if you want to come. So I ended up going to the Belfry as their head pro.
brilliant. And what was it like being at the Belfry? I mean, that was obviously a course that was
Manic.
designed by your dad. So what was that like?
Yeah, it was a manic place. I mean, it was so busy, and it's probably even busier now. But I realised the golf was huge. The golf shop back 20 odd years ago was turning over £4 million a year and things, and it was a drop in the ocean.
Wow.
I thought, this is huge, and they looked at me and they said, golf doesn't really mean anything to us. And it suddenly dawned on me that with their massive turnover, with all the green fees, all the golf shop revenue, I think at one stage I had about 28 or 29 pros working underneath me in various departments and things that I was in charge of. But the golf was probably less than 10% of the turnover of the hotel.
My goodness.
They liked it. They knew what they'd got, but, you know, hotel rooms, conferences, all that stuff that goes with it was probably first and foremost. And the golf was sold as an add-on. If you had a good company day or you wanted to be there for a couple of days, well, you know, you can play on the Brabazon course where we have had Ryder Cups.
And I was going to say, what's your memories of the Brabazon course? I know that you joined the Belfry later on, but what are your memories of the Brabazon course as a place throughout history as well?
Yeah. Well, I remember going with Dad not long after they started work, because he said to me, I'm guessing it would be about 1974, 75, they'd actually been asked by Soren Ellerman Shipping Lines, who'd bought the Belfry, because it had actually been closed up for about 3 or 4 years. It wasn't derelict, but it hadn't been operated as a hotel, whereas it had been in the 60s. And obviously it had the nightclub, which was really very famous in and around Birmingham, Coventry. Obviously there are no motorways, but it was a nightclub and music spot that a lot of the great bands, Moody Blues, Led Zeppelin, all those sort of people used to play there. And Dad said to me, he said, I used to stay there. He said, when there was a tournament in Coventry or Birmingham, he said, it was a good place. It was central. You know, we hadn't got the motorways, but he said you could get to Coventry, you could get to Sutton Coldfield, you could get to places like Little Aston quite easily staying there. So he said, I knew it when they asked me, and they had the old hotel and the land that really encompasses what's the 10th hole on the Brabazon course, the 18th green, little bit more land, the lake around there. But that was it. And Dad went to see them and they said, look, you know, do you think there's any chance we could have quite a nice pitch and putt course here, just as something? Dad said, yeah. He said, you know, Dave and I can do that. But as he's looking out over it, I wasn't with him at this time, but as he's looking out over the land, he waved his arm and said, what's all those fields over there? And they said, well, as far as we understand it, they're farms, but we don't really think they're working farms anymore. As far as we can understand, they used to be farms that just grew potatoes for Smith's Crisps, but they're not really farmed anymore. So Dad, just rather glibly as he would, he said, well, go and buy them and you can have a couple of full-size golf courses, and said goodbye to them. A couple of years later, they came back to him and said, we've got the land. So that's how they went back and then designed the Brabazon course and the Derby course. But of course, we then ran into the drought of 1976 and they'd planted thousands of little trees, all of which died. And The land was full of
Oh, goodness.
all clay and full of stones. I mean, it was a terrible bit of land.
My goodness.
Dave and Dad did a good design. That's been tweaked a bit over the years. Basically, the Brabazon course, it's had a few alterations, not that many, but a few alterations. 1 or 2 greens have been redone. They changed around the third and fourth hole early on in its existence. But basically, it just matured as the trees that they'd grown have now grown into, proper forest. It's a great location. I mean, if you're having something like Ryder Cup, slap bang in the middle of the country, masses and masses of hotels, because that's the problem for Open Championships now and almost anywhere. There's nowhere to stay. Where the Belfry is, all round Birmingham Airport, the NEC. I mean, dozens and dozens of hotel beds that people can get. So you can get, and the way the course was designed by Dave, he always designed it that it would have mounding that people could stand on. So you didn't have to put up thousands and thousands of pounds worth of stands months before the event and things like that. So that was,
and the thing that's funny
is
is you mentioned the 10th and the 18th were effectively there. I mean, obviously they had to be designed and made into golf holes, but I guess some of the thoughts were there already for the water features, and those are probably the 2 most famous holes on the Brabazon course, right? The 10th and the 18th.
Yeah, I think you're right. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, they're the ones that made it. I mean, Seve made it right early on when they had the Hennessy Cup, and he drove the 10th green. Dad and Dave, when they were building it, they stood where the tee is. I mean, they were both sort of towards the end of their career, but Dave said, I wonder if we can make this possibly. It's about 350, 320 yards from there. And he said, I just wonder, bearing in mind they were wooden woods, whether we could just tempt somebody to give it a smash onto the green. And I remember them saying they stood there for quite some time hitting balls and getting the odd shot over the water and more or less where the green may go. And they said, yeah, go on, we'll do it. But the whole point of this hole is that you actually play a 5-iron down the fairway or something. And they built a very small, thin green just over the water, which sloped to the water, bunkers all round. And they said, if you play it the way it's meant to be played, 5-iron, you've then got not long, but you've got a difficult pitch of 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 yards, depending on where you'd gone, to a very, very small green. And you want to try and get it below the hole. Otherwise, you've got a difficult putt coming down the green. And so that's how it was. So plenty of people, you could play it conservatively and still walk off having dumped it in the water or dropped a shot or gone in the bunker at the back and then gone in the water in front of the green. So, it was, I think, one of the things that I didn't agree with, but one of the owners of the Belfry subsequently wanted to alter the 10th and made the green rather bigger to try and make a thing that people could drive it. And when they had corporate days, they would push the tee forward, which you could do anyway. You could push the tee up to the ladies' tee if you wanted people to have a go when it was 250 yards. So there was no need to mess about with that. And in my opinion, when they changed and made the green much, much bigger, I think they completely destroyed the character that Dad and Dave tried to build. And I think it's a pale shadow now, the 10th, of what it was when it was first built.
18's still a bear, though. 18 is some golf hole.
18th is really a tough hole. It is. And again, it's a great hole because, do I play more down the right off the tee where it's not much of a carry, but then you've got one heck of a long second shot to get the green? Do I go closer to the water down the left, but risk not getting to the fairway? It's a great hole and would always be a very, very fine hole, whether it's in tournament play, but obviously it's particularly and has had its moments of deciding Ryder Cups and matches in Ryder Cup. So a great hole.
And then we've talked about the Ryder Cup, but I should really ask you about your experience in the PGA Cup, Gary. So you were the captain a couple of times. What was it like to lead that team in those matches and represent the PGA?
Well, I must admit, I was actually working at the Belfry when I got asked the first time, and I really wasn't expecting anything like that. But it was a fantastic honour, and it's a great match. It's only a team of 10 rather than 12, but it follows the same format as the Ryder Cup. Again, played every other year in the alternate years to the Ryder Cup, States and then Great Britain. I think the thing that is really good about it, it's one of the few events, perhaps now the only professional event, that is still a team of Great Britain and Ireland against USA rather than Europe.
Yeah.
The people who qualify to play in the PGA Cup are really the finest club pros that we've got. You do get people who have been tour players, but I think the rules are you can't have held a tour card for 2 or 3 years or something prior to qualifying for the PGA Cup. But yeah, no, we went. My first match was in the States. The PGA, it was wonderful representing our association, the players. They allowed me to go out and do a recce on the course. There were 1 or 2 things that I asked for, whether we could have a team get together beforehand, invited their partners and wives and things, which my wife looked after. I said to her, look, if you can just find out anything that the ladies might want or need, it'll just make life much easier if they know they can come to you without going to their husbands. Then it comes through me, and we can get all of that sorted. The players can concentrate on playing. That first match at Reynolds Plantation, we had a very strong team. The Americans were a very strong team, and we lost by a point, which was a very, very close. Subsequently, one of my players on that team, John Bevan, captained the side when Great Britain and Ireland had their only win in the States. But we were very close in 2007. As I say, we kind of we lost the point to some great chipping and putting and a little bit of outrageous luck from one American player in the last 3 holes, which our player was 2 up with 3 to play and ended up having birdie, eagle, birdie thrown at him to have the match snatched. So he didn't do anything wrong.
Oh.
He finished par, birdie, par himself, but he had birdie, eagle, birdie thrown at him to take what looked to be our winning point for the match away from us. But it was great. And then, I was, it was. But the American team, the USPGA, all the officials, everything about it was done so beautifully, Ross. I mean, it was fantastic. And then, when they asked me, would you do it again in 2009 at the Carrick? I mean, I thought, well, we've come so close. I've got to try and see what we can do. I think we improved a few things that we'd learned, and we, I believe, were able to be good hosts for the Americans. And funny enough, we went into the singles with the match in exactly the same state as it had been 2 years before. And all bar one of the matches came to the sort of 7th, and the damn Yanks won every single point. So the score makes it look as though we were given a right trouncing. But in fact, when you were out there, we had matches on the 17th that suddenly we'd been 1 up at the turn and they crept 2 up on the 18th, or 2 and 1 or 1 up. They all just went the Americans' way. Nothing you could do about it.
Yeah, and it's funny how match play can be like that. And teams, even at the kind of level I've played, which is club golf and occasionally county golf, you'd see one team within the first 7 or 8 holes looks like they're going to trounce the other team, and then suddenly you get to the back 9 and everybody's getting hammered. It's incredible how match play goes that way.
And I think that psychology of the match play, you get a hole that goes against you, you perhaps make a bad decision, lose the hole. That's the joy of golf, is that, you're out there for 4 hours or maybe longer these days, but you're actually in action, really in action for only about 3 or 4 minutes, I suppose, in that time. It's obviously a bit longer with the thinking, but it plays on your mind. If you make a mistake when you were 1 up and suddenly, I should have won that hole, I was in the driving seat and then I had a 3-putt or I missed the green. And it's so easy to let it play on your mind, which perhaps in stroke play you can put behind you. But I still think even in stroke play it's very difficult. Golf, without any doubt, in my opinion, is the hardest game because of the psychology and how much time you have to think to control yourself. I think going back to the 2009 match, one of the things that was lovely, Dad actually came up for the opening ceremony. I asked him whether he would, and Jackie said, oh, you should go. And he made the journey all the way from Surrey to Scotland. And it was lovely, as I was doing my bit on my hind legs, to have him sitting right behind me. And he said afterwards, you've done something I haven't done. And he said, you've done it twice. He said, I've done almost everything in golf. But he said, I've never captained a side like that. And he said, you've done it twice. And he said, that's well done. Dad was lucky enough to do, he never won a major championship, but pretty much everything else in the game he did.
And just speaking of your dad, some of the questions I've got here to get us into more about his history in the game. I'm going to ask a kind of simple question. When did you first realise your dad was famous? When did it first hit you?
I guess that was when I was about 6 years old. and he was taking me for a haircut in Bournemouth to his hairdressers that he has in Westover Road. It was like George Fairweather was the hairdresser, and we'd been in, had our haircut. We were walking back to where he used to park his car, and two ladies were coming in the other direction, and they sort of did a military two-step in front of him and blocked his. He tried to go one side, and they went the same way. And eventually, they said, "Excuse me, are you Peter Alliss?" He said, "Yes, I am." "Oh, we thought you were when we were coming down the road. Sign this, will you?" And they scrabbled about in their handbags and produced a bit of paper. Well, I was used to people asking Dad for their, but it was always at the golf course. It was the first time I'd ever seen anybody actually stop him, recognise him in the street. So I think that was the first time that I realised he was. I remember going home to my mother and saying, Mum, two women stopped Dad in the street for his autograph, at which he laughed at. And she said, "It's quite unusual, not on the golf course." But then, of course, as his fame grew and his TV work, and he became so well known, it was people were generally very good, but and Dad was good with them. But if you were out, sometimes people would come up if you're having dinner and interrupt, and Dad generally would deal with it. Sometimes if there were a number of people, he would say, "Well, look, give me till I finish my coffee. If you're still here, I'll come over and sign for you." But I must admit, I had, and again, I talk about this when I do my talks and in other bits and pieces, but I had some interactions and knowledge in dealing with Bobby Charlton over the years. And his daughter, Suzanne Charlton, who used to do the weather, I don't know if you can remember, she used to do the weather for BBC many years ago. And sadly, they're not married anymore, but she was married to Nick Brown, who was one of our very best tennis players at the time. And they used to come down to Devos, and we went out for dinner once to Rick Stein's seafood restaurant. And we were having, it was a lovely dinner. But eventually I think the manager of the seafood restaurant sort of sidled up to him and said, I don't think he was Sir Bobby then. They came up to him and said, "Mister, we have rather a queue of people outside the door who are asking, they've spotted you inside, asking whether you might sign their autograph." And Bobby was as good as gold. And I've looked at Karen, my wife, and looked across at Suzanne, who's sort of just shaking her head, and Norma, Bobby's wife. Bobby was lovely. He said, "Yes," he said, "but I'm here with my family." He said, "But we've had our dessert." He said, "When coffee comes, set me up with a table just by the door there and bring me a coffee." And he said, "You organise them and they can all come in and I'll sign." And anyway, he disappeared. And we looked over, and sure enough, by the door, he was sitting at a little table, shaking hands with all the people. It was before phone cameras, so nobody was there taking his photograph. But he sat there for probably 45 minutes. And then I thought, my dad's famous, but boy, he's not got a patch on Bobby Charlton.
Oh, that's funny. That's brilliant. And then in terms of your dad's career, Harry, did he talk much about his own career with you in terms of what he'd played in and what his results were? Was that something that he would
I think I just lived it with him, really, because Mum and Dad were married in 1953. Dad had just won the Assistants Championship. He got in the Ryder Cup side in 1953. I was born in 54. So really, I just grew up. And he always said he would finish his playing career when he was 40. He said, "I don't want to play any longer than I'm 40. So
really?
He won all his, he always said that from all his life. He said, "No, I'm done then." And I think he would have been quite content to be a club pro, but he didn't want to play. He loved the pleasure of winning, obviously, but he actually just didn't enjoy playing. I mean, he didn't enjoy the gut-churning nervousness and all of that, which, when people say they know him, and he always seemed very confident when he was on the telly, and he was pretty confident on the golf course, but he hated it. I mean, he really didn't. He didn't like that side of it. But pretty much all his wins was when I was a kid. I kind of knew, and we had the big trophy cabinet, and occasionally I would look at it, and I would look at them as my mum was cleaning the trophies. I could see Italian, German, Portuguese, 3 PGA Championship. I mean, he won an awful lot of events without obviously winning a British Open or any other major.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, I mean, your dad's incredibly famous for, like, even my generation. I turned 50 this year. He was famous for, like, A Round with Alice. He was famous for being on the BBC and doing all the commentary and stuff. But I definitely missed out on knowing a lot about your dad's career. And I actually went to a talk that your dad had done. I think he did a tour basically around Britain. And he talked about winning, I think it was like the Italian Open, the Spanish Open, the French Open. He won all these national Open championships, and I genuinely had no idea. So it was incredible what a playing career he had.
He won 3 in 3 weeks. The Italian, Spanish and Portuguese Open at the end of the season. And he wanted the season to carry. They were the last 3 events. I think it was 57, 58. And they were the last 3 events of the season. And he won all 3 of those 3 weeks on the trot. So, I always say, when people ask, I mean, Dad was lucky. Not everything worked, but he had a bit of a Midas touch. He was a very successful player. He went on to be known as the voice of golf. He had an enormously long career with the TV, both here and in the States. And in fact, he was the only person, and I don't know if it's changed, I don't think it has, but they had a thing, ABC had a thing that when you got to 70 years old, whatever sport you were in, an announcer, as they call it, or whatever, you had to retire. Dad thought, well, that'll be... Anyway, they when he was about to be 70, they sent him another contract and gave him another 3 years. And they said, we'll review it again. So I think he actually ended up doing about 6 more years in America. And they used to give him his own little slot in between one of the ad breaks where he would just sit, a bit like we are now. He would just sit and waffle to the viewers about whatever came into his head. So, he had a bit of a Midas touch. He was a great player, fantastic broadcaster. I mean, he wrote 25 books or something. That a lot of them, I guess, you can find if you go on Amazon or something. And his name is on, I think it's something like 97 or 98 golf courses as the designer.
Yeah, so and I've played a few of them.
Yeah. So, he was pretty good.
Absolutely. But I'd love to talk as well, Gary, about the man who, it sounds like, taught you in the early years, so your grandfather, Percy.
Yeah.
Because, if my generation doesn't know a huge amount about your dad for his career, imagine with people who could be listening, they've probably got no idea about your grandfather, but I think it'd be great to hear some of the stories about Percy and who he was, what he was like, and his record as a golfer, and just bring that to life.
Yeah. Well, Grandad was born just at the end of the 1897, and he was one of 9 children, and the youngest bar one. And his father had a small market garden and also a gardening business. So, they were on the borders of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire where they lived. I suppose for the times he had his own business that was quite successful. So they weren't poor people. But Grandad and his brother, who was just older than him, were both keen sports people. They played a bit of golf, and they used to caddy at Hallamshire Golf Club in Sheffield. And in fact, both of them had trials, and both of them had trials, were accepted to and offered. And his brother did take up the position at Yorkshire Cricket, but Grandad always wanted to play golf. So he was looking at seeing whether he could become an assistant pro. And he actually, just before the start of the Great War, he spoke to the pro at Hallamshire, where he'd been caddying, and the pro said, I'll give you a go as an assistant. So Grandad would have been, about 17 when the war broke out. And of course, as soon as the war broke out, he was about to start work, joined up for the war, sent to France, survived, although, as I say, he did get shot a couple of times, once more seriously towards the end of the war, and it took him a while to recover. Anyway, when he had recovered and went back to Hampshire, he found that the pro had been killed in the war, and so there was no job.
Oh, my goodness.
So he set about looking for somewhere else to go, and he actually fetched up in South Wales and managed to get himself a job at Royal Porthcawl, which is where he started his career. And, he was a good player. He won, I think in 1920, he won the Welsh Professional Championship. He won 2 or 3 events. They played 36 holes on the Welsh Professional Championship in the one day, and I've got scorecards, and, ran tough Porthcawl, not as long as it is now, but, he broke 70 both times to win that. And then he was an interesting character because he was the first ever pro then at Clyne Golf Club, just on the Gower Peninsula. And then from there, it was always in his mind, and that's where he married my grandmother. And my grandmother's father was a successful fisherman and had quite a fleet of trawlers running out of Hull and sort of Swansea. And they were members at Porthcawl. My grandmother was a little bit older than Grandad. And I'm sure that Joseph Rust, her father, wasn't that delighted when, the pro that was giving her lessons then wanted to take her out and things. So anyway, they got married in South Wales, and then Grandad was always looking to try and improve himself. And he took the pros job at Wanstead Golf Club in the early 70s and got involved with the fledgling Essex PGA, and also, which is now quite common, but was very uncommon then, got involved with the secretaryship of the golf club and running the golf club. He was always interested in that. So from very early in his career, he was beginning to almost combine the pro secretary role, which almost nobody did. Then after that, he had the opportunity of, as several others did, Aubrey Boomer went to Paris, and Henry Cotton went to Waterloo in Belgium, and Grandad went to Wannsee Country Club in Berlin, where he was from the mid-20s until after my dad was born, and had a great time there. So there are many, many stories that, again, I recount when I'm doing talks on the family of Grandad.
I was going to say, am I right in remembering that your dad was like was he not the heaviest baby ever born at the time? Was he not the record size of a baby, like 13 pounds or something crazy?
That's absolutely right. He was, for a lot of years, about 50 years, I think, till it was broken. He was the heaviest baby that had ever been born in Europe, 14 pounds, 11 ounces. And my grandmother gave birth to him naturally. I don't think she rode her bicycle for about 3 months afterwards. But
that's incredible. And then how long did they stay out in Germany as a pro out in the Berlin area?
They were out there until 1932. And then the German government was on the edge of the German government, but wasn't in a position of power. But the finances of Germany were in a mess, having been a wonderful place in the 20s. And the then German government, which was about to become very soon after that the Third Reich, they'd already made the decision to freeze foreign nationals' bank accounts. And particularly the target was on Jewish people to start off with, but then anybody who was a foreigner. And my grandmother took a phone call. I mean, it shows how stupid I am. I mean, I never thought about this, but I never asked Grandad about it. And it was only a long time after he died. And I thought, is there a long time? And I was talking to Dad about this. And I said, did Grandad speak German? And he looked at me and he said, he lived there for about 8 years. He said, how many Germans do you think spoke English in the mid-1920s? He said, of course they did. How gormless am I? My grandmother took a phone call from their bank manager, who was also a member at the golf club. And he said, Mrs. Alliss, Frau Alliss, or whatever, I've had a directive from the German government that I have to freeze your bank account. And he said, I'm telling you this, if you come to the bank right now, I will backdate a couple of withdrawals to the previous days. I will I can't allow you to take, I'm worried for my own safety if I let you empty your bank account. But he said, I will make some withdrawals. And he said, my advice to you would be that you and your husband and your family, Dad's older brother, and Dad was a year older, he said, I think at the earliest opportunity you should leave Germany. And so almost overnight, they packed up and left. And my grandma spent the next 2 or 3 nights sewing their cash into their clothes, into the linings of their clothes, so that they could smuggle it out past the checkpoints and the security, because they already closed the borders out of Germany.
My goodness, wow. That's an incredible story, isn't it?
Yeah. But they left behind, they had a beautiful bungalow. They drove to the station, left their car, and just got on a train to get to Holland, to get out of the country, and just left house, car, left everything behind, packed as much as they could, took Grandad's trophy and got in the car and left. So, so that was how they left there. And then Grandad had a couple of other pros jobs. He was pro at Beaconsfield for a while, and Temple Newsam in Leeds. And then eventually in 1939, he took the pros job at Ferndale, and that's where he finished his career. But the last few years of his career, he was also secretary pro at Ferndale. So that's
almost like what you would say is it's almost like a director of golf these days, isn't it? That type of role, being the pro and the secretary.
Yeah, it was. And as I said, and I didn't mention it, I should have done really, because next year is the centenary of the German PGA. And Grandad was really instrumental in the foundation of the German PGA, using the model of the British PGA. He helped set up the German PGA, and I'm hoping that we may be able to. They've asked me. I'm hoping we may be able to do something to mark their centenary and the fact that Grandad was in Berlin, 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's incredible. Incredible. And just for yourself, Gary, being part of that family, have you ever felt any pressure living up to the name or having the name Alliss? What's it been like for you?
Well, the only time was when I was trying to play. Then it was, and as I said to you at the start, wasn't anything like the player that I would have liked to have been. But I played in one or two events. The only thing I found was, of course, that if I played in an event, the newspaper guys used to rock up just to see how Gary Alliss was getting on, and if I'd have been almost any other young assistant, I'm sure nobody would have taken any notice. But a couple of times, I didn't play very well signing off for, maybe an 80 or an 81 or something. And there'd always be a snippet in the bottom that somebody had, Gary Alliss signed off for an 81 and they couldn't resist that, will never be as good as his father or something like that.
Oh my God, really? Dear me.
But Dad used to say that about him. Dad always joked. He said it was when he started out, he would just be down as P. Alliss. And he said if it was him and if he did well and shot a 67 or a 68 or something, the papers would write in, isn't it remarkable how Percy keeps going, in his 50s or something. But if Dad then had a 77, it was like, well, Peter Alliss, he can't play. He's not got the talent of his father. Dad always used to say that to me. But Dad always said as well, he said to me, I can't quite remember when, but he'd come down to Trevose and we were just sitting together. And he said to me, somebody had come over and shaken his hand and said hello to me. And he said, how do you find it then, being my son? And I said, well, it is what it is. I can't change it. I don't really know what the question is. He said, yeah. And I said, well, I'd much rather people acknowledge me. I enjoy that rather than being a nobody. And he said, that's good. He said, he said, you seem to handle it very well. So I said, I said, do you have the same thing? He said, yes, I hated it. So I said, oh. He said, yeah. He said, I found it incredibly difficult being your grandfather's son. Incredibly difficult. And he said, the only thing I can tell you is, and he said it was exactly the same for me, is he said, you will never be free until I'm dead. And he said, that's what I found. He said, I was never free until your grandfather died. And funny enough, Dad died, as you know, Ross, just before Christmas in 2020. And it wasn't at first, but it was probably a couple of years afterwards when, at that time I was almost 7, whereas Dad was in his 40s when Percy died. And I'm delighted he lived so long. But a couple of years after he died, I suddenly realized that I knew what he meant. He said, because I did what I did. I was still teaching it. I still do refereeing. At the time, I was doing some commentary for the Euro Pro Golf Tour for Sky and things. But a couple of years after he'd gone, I suddenly realized people actually come and ask me, or they come and ask me to do talks, and they asked me. They don't ask Peter Alliss' son.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important as well, Gary. You've had such a great career in your own right. It's important that people hear that story as well. And you've got some amazing stories about your family to hear as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is.
I was going to say, just one final question here, Gary. What's your favourite golf memory? What would you say is your favourite golfing memory from your career?
Well, I think the favourite really comes, although we didn't win that PGA Cup in America, I think the pomp and the ceremony and leading out the team and the national anthem and having military leaders out in the States and again in Scotland, having Dad come to Scotland when those 2 weeks are really the highlight, representing the family, the players, and the Great Britain and Ireland PGA is without any doubt it was absolutely fantastic. And the fact that, Karen, my wife, was there with me and, we were able to do that together. It would have been great to win, but just the memory of actually being asked to do it and having the honour of doing it twice, which is very unusual, was the best.
Fantastic. And Gary, if people want to get in touch, I know you still do public speaking and you'll do custom events for people. How could they get in touch with you?
Well, they can get in touch. I'm on LinkedIn. People can get in touch through LinkedIn. I'm also on Facebook. People can send me a message through Messenger, or if they're on LinkedIn, I'm easily contactable through there. If again, anybody comes back to you, by all means, pass them on. You know, they can send me an email if they want, alissgary@gmail.com.
In the show notes as well. But thanks so much for coming on. It's been great to hear from you, and thanks for sharing the Alliss family story.
Oh, no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me, Ross. It's been fun talking to you and reminiscing over the family. Thank you very much.
Hope you enjoyed this episode with Gary Alliss. You can find the show on Instagram at Link by Golf Podcast for future episodes, clips and insights. I'm Ross McGuire. Thanks for listening.
Lomond Golf Tours have helped thousands of guests build bespoke golf trips to create a magical experience. Travel in style with our executive chauffeur travel, whether it's golf on a major championship venue or one of our hidden gems, 5-star accommodation or a boutique bed and breakfast, or is it whiskey tasting on a private boat? Lomond Golf Tours are here to help build the tour of a lifetime. Whether you're celebrating a special occasion or ticking it off your bucket list, embark on a trip that you'll remember forever. Visit www.lomondgolftours.com.